Agile Software Development in Practice, a 66-minute presentation held at the Whitworth Conference Centre, Shrivenham, on the 11th of December 2006. The speaker is Helen Sharp, Senior Lecturer in the Computing Department of the Open University. Helen Sharp.
Yes, I'm from the Centre for Computing Research at the Open University. Although I'm in academia, I actually spend most of my time with practitioners. I go to practitioner conferences, I actually go and study practitioners, I sit with teams, I spend time actually working with them. And what I'm going to talk about today is experiences of sitting with Agile teams. This is Agile software development. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, I'll give you a brief introduction to that shortly. So I'm going to be talking about Agile software development in practice. So just to give you an overview of the talk, I'll tell you a little bit about XP, and that's extreme programming, not Windows XP, and the kind of research that we've done, which is mostly observational studies, but I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. I'll give you a brief overview of the teams that we've spent time with that the presentation is based upon, so you have an idea of what kinds of practice I'm talking about. Then there's two particular things that I want to try and get across today. The first is to do with XP's rhythm. It has a very clear rhythm of development. People who work in the area all the time talk about the heartbeat of development. There's a very strong rhythm of development that goes through the day, the week, the month. And I'm going to try and communicate some of that to you. Second thing I want to try and do is to talk about two particular key artifacts that are used in extreme programming, which are the sort of foundation really of coordination and communication amongst the team members. So I'll talk in a little bit more detail about that and present some analysis that we've done. And finally, I want to make some points about our overall work, some issues for discussion, things that have particularly struck us. I'm saying us because there's a team of three of us that does this work. Things that have struck us that I think are particularly interesting and where we go from here. So first of all, extreme programming, XP. It's one of several Agile methods. How many people here know about Agile software development? So most of you actually know about it then, so that's good. But if you want to know more, you may well have already found that website, agilealliance.org. There's huge amounts of information there about Agile development and experiences and research people are doing and stuff like that. But the thing about XP, extreme programming, is it's very, very code-oriented. It's very much about code is what we need to develop. The focus is very much on developing code. It's also supposed to provide, and I say supposed to provide because this is a claim, sustainable culture of software development. So instead of having to work some days 12 hours in order to get the code finished by the deadline, the idea is that you have a fairly regular way of working. You do 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week maximum. You're not supposed to work more than 40 hours a week. And you take breaks, and life's quite enjoyable, and people have fun. And that's actually true. People in XP teams are having fun developing software. So the idea is it's a sustainable kind of development. Because I think one of the problems people were finding with the sort of traditional way of developing things is that people were burning out. They would suddenly get a rush and have to do an awful lot of code. There was a deadline they couldn't meet. The quality suffered. The team suffered. The client was upset. The user got something they couldn't use. And things weren't actually very sustainable, and it wasn't necessarily good quality. I'm not saying that's true of everything, but I think that's what XP was developed in order to counteract. So in the original version of XP, because there's two versions, there's a more recent one, but the teams that I'm talking about all picked up on XP from the original book. And there aren't many teams I know of who've picked up many of the practices in the second edition. So there are 12 practices. For example, pair programming, you've probably heard about. 40-hour week, I already mentioned. Small releases and simple design. So the idea is that you're producing things in small time boxes. There's an explicitly stated value system, communication, feedback, simplicity, courage and respect. So you communicate a lot. It doesn't mean you write a thick, hefty document. It means you talk to people. You actually try and find out what the user wants, what the client wants, what your pair is doing, what the other people in the team are doing. You do that through talking to people rather than writing things down. Might be through instant messaging, but basically the idea is that you talk to people. Feedback. You have a very tight feedback loop. You get feedback again from your peers, you get feedback from the code, because you're continuously testing. So one of the things is you do test first design. So you write your tests first, You produce the code to run against the tests. You run regression tests. You know what I mean by regression tests? Regression tests means that, because quite often what happens, you have a piece of code that's working, you make a change to it, and you test the change, but if you don't test the rest of the things to make sure you haven't broken something else, you might have broken the code that was already working, and that's called regression testing. Okay. So you're getting feedback from the regression tests, feedback from the users, from the clients, so rapid feedback all the time. Do the simplest thing, have courage to say to the users, the clients, no, we can't do that. We haven't got time. If you want 10 things done, okay, but that'll take you twice as long. We can do these 5. We can do these 5 to a good quality in the time you have available. We can't do 10. So courage is another of the values. And respect for each other, respect for the code, respect for everything and everybody. So that's XP in a nutshell. A couple of views from Dilbert, of course. He always has something to say about these things. I will let you read them. I have to say that in my experience, neither of these is actually true. But they are quite amusing. The top one, actually, about sort of pairing. Because teams do work in pairs. Not all the time, but most of the time they are working as a pair. And I said to somebody once, what do you do? There must be people that you work with that you don't like. We all have people we work with that we, don't quite get on with. I said, what do you do? Because the idea is that everyone should pair with everybody else. You do have this constant rotation of people. So you're supposed to pair with everybody in the team. And he said, well, yeah, there are some days I get up and I think, I've got to pair with Joe today. All right, I just have to bite the bullet and do it. And that tends to be the attitude that people, if there's someone they don't really like working with, instead of walking away from it saying, right, I'm not going to do it, they recognise it's quite important to pair and to keep the shared knowledge going within the team. So they will actually do that. So having said that doesn't happen, there is that sense sometimes that people don't necessarily want to pair, but they will actually do it anyway. So what have we done? Most of my time I do observational studies. So as I say, I actually spend time with the teams. So when I say time with the teams, I have a full-time teaching job as well. So unfortunately I don't have months to do this. But I normally spend at least a week with the team. And then I'll go back and see them again shortly afterwards, maybe for a day. I might go back again depending on what's happening. So I sort of keep in touch with them afterwards, keep in touch with updates and things as they change. And my focus has been on the social and the cultural kinds of aspects, focusing very much on practitioners, so people developing real systems in real environments. That doesn't mean that I ignore the technical. It's just not my focus. There's lots of people out there who look at technical, and I'm happy to answer technical questions if you've got any. But I actually believe that the Agile approach works because of the social environment it creates, rather than just because of the technical tools that are used. I do interviews, I do participant observation. Now, participant is in small letters and in brackets, because in the space of a week, I can't honestly walk into a team and be able to understand what they're developing and really participate in the team. I mean, it's just not possible to do it. But I do take part where I can. So if they have a design discussion, I'm sometimes asked for my opinion about things. So I'm sort of a different kind of catalyst that they draw upon. So it's not really participant observation, but a little bit, as best I can. And I look at documents. Documents can include online wikis. They use wikis quite a lot in XP teams. So I'm looking at all those sorts of different kinds of things, and it depends on what's happening and any particular issues that occur as to what things I will decide to do, what kind of approaches I will use. We are software developers. I was trained as a software engineer. I worked in the City of London for several years on projects. So I do regard myself, and I'm a certified engineer, whatever that may mean, but I do regard chartered engineer. So I do regard myself as a software developer, as are my colleagues. But what that means is that we have to treat the things that we would regard as familiar. One of the things about doing observational studies is that you have to somehow take a step back and also see them a bit as strange. So I'm being a stranger in the environment, and yet I understand what's going on. So it's a bit of a sort of split kind of role. It's important to be familiar, because the teams I work with then are happy to talk to me about what they're doing, and they don't have to explain everything. If you have social scientists go in and do this kind of work, which they have done in the past, they're constantly asking questions about, well, but what does that mean and why are you doing that? Whereas I can sit with somebody developing Java using Eclipse, and I understand what's going on. I understand the code, I understand the environment. So I have a different kind of level of understanding. So that's sort of what we do. And the analysis approach, there's two different ways that we've analysed the data we collect. One is just looking at the data and trying to understand what themes are coming out of the data. So it's a very qualitative kind of approach. And the second one is to use theoretical frameworks. And I put distributed cognition there as an example because I'll be talking about that in the second part when I talk a bit more about some of the detailed work that we've done. So that gives you an idea of the kind of research approach we take. So what I'm going to do now is just go through relatively quickly the teams that this talk is based upon. Team A, of course I have to anonymise these for confidentiality. I don't suppose you'll identify any of the people in the pictures. Sometimes I have that problem because the people I'm talking to are actually, some of the people in the audience are those that I've observed. That's really quite disconcerting. Anyway, Team A developed intelligent web adverts. So if you're looking at a football site, it might come up and suddenly say, would you like to place a bet with such and such a company? I don't know if you've come across these things, but they're little adverts that are, okay, they're sort of content specific. So it recognises what you're looking at and will choose a relevant advert and display it on the screen. That comes from these people. Team size about 14, they're developing in Java. Team B, they develop in C++. Team size about 23. I'm saying about because the trouble is that you have people coming and going into the team, different kinds of customers. It depends if you count certain business analysts. Some of these teams have business analysts in them, some don't. Anyway, 23. They develop pieces of software that compare documents within a multi-author environment. So they're used, for example, by solicitors who need to check whether two documents are the same. And so it's an automatic process. So that's Team B. Team C, we're developing operational risk software in a large international bank. Team size 12 plus, and again in Java. Team D, again in a large international bank, and they were dealing with database migration. So there were 4, maybe 5 databases currently in existence, and they were bringing them all together into one database. So that's sort of like an internal project, but quite a heavily technical project. Team size 11, developing in Java. You'll see there's a pattern here. And Team E, they develop the software that runs things like the National Rail timetable inquiry and travel alerts, things that be sent to your mobile phone or you can get them through the web. So they develop that software. Their team is about 25 plus, and they develop in Java too. One of the things that I have wondered about, I mean, there's definitely something about the tool set that you have to support the developers. So, as I say, I mean, Java is the key language, the main language that people seem to use. C++, that team was the first, and at one time the only team, using C++ for XP. These are all mature, by the way. These all been using XP for at least a year when we went in to see them. So they're all mature XP teams. But there was a team I went to see that I'm not talking about today particularly, but I'll mention it because they were quite interesting. They were in a large insurance company, and half the team programmed in COBOL on mainframes, and half the team used Smalltalk on front-end machines. So it was a web application, so the Smalltalk was the front end and the COBOL mainframes was the back end. And they used XP for a while, and the Smalltalk people were quite happy using XP, did all the practices, loved it, really enjoyed it. COBOL developers said it's not for us, we don't like it. And when I tried to find out why they didn't like it, it was actually very difficult for them to express it. Or they didn't want to express it, I don't know. But I didn't get a very good answer. There's something about the tool support and possibly the language itself which facilitates this kind of development or not. So that's an interesting sort of issue that I haven't pursued at the moment, but any thoughts would be welcome. And the COBOL developers, as soon as they had the opportunity, they dropped XP. They didn't want anything to do with it, they just dropped it and ran away from it. So they're my teams, and I just want to now get into this notion of the rhythms. What are the rhythms in an XP development? And there's 2 key ones that I'm going to talk about. The third one is sort of similar to the middle one. So the daily rhythm, you have a daily rhythm of things. People come in the morning, they normally drift in, and it's amazing, this is across all 5 teams, there's commonalities across all 5 teams. They come in between sort of, say, 9:15 and 9:30-ish, And they'll sit and do personal email, maybe look at their own books, or, whatever. They're doing stuff on their own, anyway. The keen ones are actually doing some code development, but mostly they're doing other kinds of work. And then you have something called a stand-up, which I'll talk to you about in just a moment. And that's basically a meeting. And the stand-up really marks the beginning of the day. Then they go into pairing conversations once the stand-up is finished. And that's the rest of the day. They're doing pairing work. And then the end of the day, people tend to drift away at about 5:30, 6 o'clock. Sometimes earlier than that. But there is definitely a key sort of time. There's a bulge in the middle of the day, if you like, where there's lots of work and lots of activity and lots of things going on. And then it tails off again in the evening. And people do go home at 6 o'clock. They might go down the pub and carry on coding. I've seen that happen. But they do actually leave the office at 6 o'clock. Then sort of these daily rhythms fit within what's called an iteration, which is the time box of development. That's usually between 1 and 3 weeks. Most teams I've seen now, that I'm aware of now, do the 1 week iteration. But certainly that's not across the board. But it's a short duration, short time boxing of development. And the daily rhythms obviously fit inside there. But you have a sort of pre-planning activity very often. The idea of, at the beginning of an iteration, you have to work out what are you going to produce by the end of the iteration. So the pre-planning and the planning game are about deciding what you're going to do. Then the daily rhythm is you getting on and doing it, basically. I'm going to give you more detail about this in a minute. This is just to give you an overview of where I'm going. And then at the end of an iteration, you have something called a retrospective, which is where you look back and you say, okay, what went well, what didn't go well. You have a sort of a larger scale view of development as well, which is called a release. And releases might be every 3 months, might be every 6 months, might be every month. It really all depends on the team and the kind of development that they're undertaking. And that has a very similar kind of pattern to the iteration. So I won't be talking any more about that as such, but it's a similar kind of thing. But in all these teams you get this kind of rhythm. Everything is going through the same kind of thing, day by day, week by week. You do the same things. Every Friday you have a pre-planning meeting for the following iteration, which starts on Monday. Every day you have a stand-up, and then you go into pairs and you do that all day. So there's a very, very clear rhythm to things. But before I go into the detail of it, I have to take a slight sidestep, otherwise you won't understand some of what I'm talking about, and actually mention stories. Have you come across stories? So what is a story? Basically, it's the requirements for the system. Requirements for the system are captured in terms of stories. So it's a description of something a system needs to do. It's a unit of customer visible functionality. That's quite important because the customer, and the customer might be the client, might be the user, might be the person who pays the bills. There's all sorts of different kinds of people, might be hidden in customer. I'm not going to discuss that today because that's a big issue in itself. But if you can just think of customer as being that kind of person, the person who's going to review the system. So it's quite important it's a unit of customer visible functionality because the customer is going to check this every iteration. They're going to get feedback to the team every iteration about what's happening. So it's a unit of customer visible functionality. It's also a promise of a conversation because just jumping to the bottom one for a minute, stories are written on these things. It's written on a 3x5, possibly 5x7, but usually 3x5 index card. So all your requirements are written on that. So it has to be a conversation because you cannot possibly write everything you need to know on a card. All right? You have to actually talk to somebody about it. If you find that you're filling up the card, then it's not a story and you're writing too much down. The conversation is very important. That's one of the key principles underlying XP. And it's the fundamental unit of development in XP. So everything is done through stories. That has both positive sides and negative sides. There's quite a lot been written about stories, how to write them. It's not easy to write good stories. You know, you're not writing a long specification here. It's got to be very short. One template that has been suggested is at the top there. As a role, so as a data entry clerk, I want certain behaviour of the system to be able to delete what I've just put in so that if I make a mistake, I can put it right. What I've just said there is very noddy, all right? The benefit is intended to be actual real business value. XP does stress business value quite a lot as well. So the example that I've got there was actually from Team A, who was doing the adverts, intelligent adverts. And it says, I want an ad that shows what you would win for a £10 bet, not showing odds less than 4 to 1, only for correct scope. And at the bottom here, it's got the name of the person who, people, so it's Carla and David, who asked for that story to happen, and the date. And if you look very carefully, you probably can see the sellotape, because I was just too slow to stop them ripping it up. This actually is a story that they decided they then didn't want. So they wrote the story, and in the process of doing the planning, they decided actually they didn't really want that one, so they threw it away. And that's another key message from XP. If you don't need it, don't keep it. Throw it away. And they actually ripped things up and just put them in the bin. That was it. And I was just too late, so I had to snatch it back and stick it back together again. But that's what a story is, right? It's a very small piece of functionality. Just for a minute, a bit more detail about the daily rhythm. All right? So it starts the day, as I said, you go through stand-up, pairing conversations, and then it's the end of the day. So at the start of the day, people just come in and do their own things. Then they go into something called stand-up, which is about 15 minutes. Shouldn't be more than 15 minutes. And it is literally a stand-up meeting. You don't sit down in a stand-up, you literally stand up. Of course, one of the reasons for that is that you actually can't stand up for about much more than 15 minutes without getting fidgety. So it's deliberately designed that way. Who takes part? The developers will take part, the customers will take part, managers if there are managers around. It's anybody in the team. And of course anybody who's co-located or who can be available by video phone or audio phone or whatever else. The teams that I'm talking about here all were co-located. However, a team I'm working with at the moment, they're not co-located, and the customer is off-site somewhere else. So when they run their stand-up, they actually have the customer call in. So the customer is sort of like, there's a phone in the middle of the table, basically. But they are available and there at the time for the stand-up. One of the teams had a split stand-up because they had developers, but they also were working with business analysts. So they'd have a stand-up which was about 5 or 10 minutes for developers, and then the business analysts would join in, and they'd join in for the second sort of 5-7 minutes of the stand-up. So there are different ways that people run these meetings, depends on your situation again and the team and who's involved. But the idea behind the stand-up is to report on yesterday's work, to identify and communicate to others any issues or problems that people have come across, deciding what to do next, and choosing pairs. And you actually literally go around the team. Everybody in the team says something about what they did yesterday and what they're going to do today, working out what stories they're going to do in the following day and who's going to work with whom. XP teams are very self-organising, so you don't have the idea of a manager stands there and says, right, I want you to pair with you today, you go off and do that story. It doesn't happen. I haven't seen it happen at all. There was one team where we had someone who was a manager who sort of fed stories. So he'd come and say, all right, here's the set of stories we have to do this iteration. And it's quite unusual to have someone actually do that, but he was sort of acting as a manager and a customer in some respect. But so he would feed the stories through to them, but then the team was left to do it, to organise themselves as to how they actually got it done in that time.
If you had the pairs, would they
Yes.
change around a lot?
Yes. There is a paper called Promiscuous Pairing by a guy who reckons that you should actually swap every 15-20 minutes. I think that's a bit much. The teams that I've seen, Team A, they would swap sometimes twice a day, depending on what's happening with the stories. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to wait till the end of the story before you swap. Sometimes you'd have one person who's stuck with the story and other people swap in and out, depending on sort of how time was going. You do need some level of consistency. I've not seen anybody say, okay, you two worked on that story yesterday, neither of you's working on it today, we'll have some completely new pair work on that. There has to be a level of consistency there. But to have someone work on a story for a day, have someone else join him for half a day, and then he leaves and someone else comes in, that's happened. So you do have this swapping around. Yeah.
But you could get people sort of waiting, so someone finishes a story,
yeah,
and he's just waiting for somebody else. There's a bit of inefficiency there.
Right, so what tends to happen in those situations is there's always other work to be done. Team E, that I'll be talking about a bit more in a minute, they actually had what they called a bug wall. And when bugs come in through the customer support people, Again, they're written on story cards and they're put up on the wall. And if someone has some time at the end of the day or before lunch, or as you say, when the story's finished and they're waiting for the next pair to pick up, they take down a bug card and do something else. So, yeah, there is the potential for that, but actually in practice it tends not to work that way. There's always other things to be done.
As a manager, you're obviously going to be aware that certain pairing dynamics will work better than others. And likewise, you're going to have certain people that work better on their own.
Yeah.
Are you not, by rigidly trying to stick to these swapping pairings, what have you, sort of reducing your productivity as a company?
I can't give you any productivity data. There is such does exist, but I can't give you it now. Standing here, I can point you at the right place. However, I can tell you how people manage that kind of thing, how the teams cope with that kind of thing. Pairing, I'll come on to pairing in a minute, but I'll say it now. Pairing is very intensive. It's very tiring. It's really hard to do. Because if you're sitting with someone and you're trying to understand how they're solving a problem, and you're really following someone else's thought processes, or they're trying to follow yours and you're having to explain what you're doing, it's very, very tiring. So 5 hours-ish pairing a day is the maximum that I've seen any team do. That's with breaks, but a total of 5 hours a day is about right. And when we've said that back to teams that we've observed, they've agreed that you actually can't really pair more than about 5 hours a day. And so that's sort of the first thing to say, is that actually people are not pairing constantly. It's not sort of 7 hours a day or anything like that. You do have a break. Team B, it was quite common to have what we call singletons, but basically people working on their own, so individuals working on their own. Either because no one else particularly wanted to work on that story at that time, or because the person who was supposed to be working on that has been pulled off to do something else, or they've got to go to a dentist appointment, or, there could be all sorts of reasons why somebody is in the end left on their own working through. But when that person comes back to the pair, or when they go through to the stand-up, the key thing is that they then share the knowledge, the experience, as I said, the issues and the problems. That's the key thing, is that lot is shared. And pairing is very good for getting people to really understand what's happening in the code. And that has lots of positive sides to it. The downside, as I say, is that pairing is actually very intensive and very tiring. And I'll come on to a slide where I talk about some of the problems with this as well. So I don't know whether I've answered your question. I mean, I can point you at productivity data. And the evidence there says that actually quality is improved and your productivity is not decreased by doing this kind of thing. We do need more studies in that area, but that's where we stand at the moment. If you look at the top there, you can see that you've got one monitor with 2 chairs. And in this company, they actually had desks specifically designed so that 2 people could sit at one monitor. In other places, they've had to rip desks apart in order for it to work, stuff like that. But yes, that is what you get. And the standard way of talking about it, that you have a navigator and a driver. The navigator is the one who sits and stares, and the driver is the one who sits with the actual keyboard, right? In practice, that's not what happens. Yes, of course, only one person can be typing at the keyboard at any one time, but it's much more fluid than that. If one person is following through their train of thought, then they'll keep typing, with the other one possibly asking questions, but more often going, right, yeah, I see, what about that? Sort of going through it and sort of supporting the other person. It's quite common to see one person holding the mouse and the other person at the keyboard. So they're both sort of trying to be engaged. And I know it sounds daft, doesn't it? It sounds as though they're going to be fighting over it, but it just doesn't work like that. It does get to be a very fluid kind of, well, we've called it a conversation, but it's fluid action. So it's not a rigid, I'm the driver, you can't touch anything, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to be typing. Yes, sometimes people will dictate code, so the person who's the navigator supposedly dictates code to the one who types it in. Sometimes you do have someone who sits for 2 or 3 hours and they're the driver for all of that time. Again, I mean, it varies very much from pair to pair and how they work. Okay, so that's the stand-up. That was sort of like the first sort of formal bit, if you like, of the day. And I just wanted to show this again as a slight light relief. We found this this picture in the late 19th century. This was St Kilda Parliament. They had a stand-up every day in the morning. The gentlemen only. The ladies didn't take part. gentlemen only, and they'd stand around and they'd discuss what they were going to do for the day. And if they couldn't decide, they did nothing. Yes. XP teams, however, are not quite like that. They do decide to do something. They are actually active. Okay, so pairing, I've talked a little bit about that. People often talk about pair programming. Actually, it's not just about programming. It's about designing, programming, refactoring, and testing. So it's pairing. I prefer to refer to it as pairing. And I've already talked a little bit about this. The fact that pairing is situated in a wider context is actually quite important, because although you're working in a pair, actually you've got the whole team around you. You're sitting in one place, you're talking to each other. Someone over the other side of the room might hear you say something that they're working on. You have this whole situational awareness business that they'll come across and say, you're working on that bit of code. Now, I worked on that yesterday, and I forgot to say in the stand-up, but this is a problem I had yesterday with it. It's not just a pair in isolation. They're working very much within a team context and within a physical environment as well. I didn't point it out at the beginning, but in some of these teams, you've got stuff all over the walls. It's a very visual, informative kind of environment anyway. So pairs are not working in isolation. It's really quite important that they're working within the wider context. The context of the stand-up, the context of availability of information and people. I did see a very amusing paper a while ago, actually, several years ago, where it was suggested it was very important that white noise should be pumped behind pairs so that they could focus on what they were doing. And it was like, no! that would really destroy it. So that's the daily rhythm of the iteration. As I said, there's some pre-planning meetings that might go on. You might be talking to the customer. There's a whole set of stuff that happens at a higher level from this XP team, which I'm not particularly going to talk about today, although I'm happy to comment on it if people have questions. But there's a whole set of stuff, because obviously you can't immediately dive down into these low-level story cards. You do have to have stuff that goes on beforehand. So you have the pre-planning that has to feed into the iteration. The planning game is actually where people decide what's going to happen in the next iteration. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The daily rhythm I've spoken about, and then you have this retrospective. Planning game. Again, who's involved? Developers estimate the stories, so how long is it going to take to develop this particular story? I should say, coming into the planning game, then you'll have a stack of stories that have been generated by somebody. Leave it at that at the moment. They've been generated by somebody. And the idea is you have to choose which of these things in this stack are going to be done in the following iteration.
Where's the judgment call that says what I can fit on the card is something I can do in an iteration period?
That's likely to happen in the pre-planning stuff that goes on. The whole thing of how do you get from that kind of high-level requirement through to something which is a story that fits on the card that's estimated to be a day or 2 days of actual development work. There's work being done on it, and people are actually doing that. Practitioners are doing things, but there's a lot of disagreement about how can it easily be done. And it does depend on the organisation's culture. I'm currently working with a very large organisation who's hitting exactly that problem. And they've got the top bit right, the early stuff is fine, and then they've got the development stuff, and it's all the stuff in the middle, which is a problem. So I can't have an answer to that, but it is an issue. Okay, so the developers estimate the stories and say how long they think it's going to take, and it does tend to be at this stage the stories are small units of development. If an iteration is a week, your intention is a story is going to be done in a week. Now, having said that, we have seen stories that have lasted 2 or 3 iterations. A, because they got the estimate wrong. B, because the analysis wasn't done properly, and it's exactly that kind of thing, that it hasn't been caught early on. So, it doesn't happen in an ideal kind of way necessarily. But at this stage, they should be that sort of size. Customers are involved, and they are supposed to prioritise stories. So they will say, these 5 have to be done this week, these 2 have to be done this week, whatever. If the developers come back and say, all right, you've said 5, but that's actually more time, it requires more time than we have available, which ones shall we not implement this time? The customer makes that decision. That's the idea. In reality, you have customer stories and you have developer stories. So if there are things that have to be done on the infrastructure, so for example, Team A had to move to a new server while I was with them, well, the customer doesn't know anything about that. The customer's not interested in that. That's a developer level issue. So what I've just said contradicts what I said before about it being a customer visible functionality. There are these discrepancies between what people are saying and what people are actually doing in reality. They find out that there are these problems. So if you read the textbooks, most people will say that it's the customer that does all this stuff. But in fact, developers get involved as well, and they do come up with stories themselves. In Team A, when they were doing this, they had a discussion with the customers and the developers about prioritizing. And the customers said, well, look, we really do have to have some of these cards come through this week. We have to have some of these stories done. And the developers were saying, but we have to move the server as well. We have to do all these things to find out about moving the server. And they came to sort of a compromise where some of the customer stories got done, but more of the developer stories got done. So, again, in reality, there is some of this negotiation that goes on. If a manager is involved, then they tend to hold the development overview. So they have a sort of a higher level view, which again will feed into some of this other stuff that's going on to get stories. And the whole purpose for this is to choose stories for the next phase. So phase is either iteration, but you also have a planning game for the release. I said I wouldn't talk about the release, but just to clarify. So you have a planning game for release, and you have a planning game for iteration. Different level things happening. And at the end of an iteration, you have a retrospective. And again, there's lots written about retrospectives, but the idea behind Agile development is that you are constantly monitoring and improving. So if something isn't working, you change it. If you go through an iteration and you discover that something's not, the process isn't quite working for you, then you do your best to improve it. Again, in Team A, one of the issues they faced was they had customers ringing up in the middle of an iteration saying, but I need this changed now. There's a bug with this, or I don't like the colour of my advert, which was one I had while I was actually there. And they were insistent they wanted it changed at that time. And so they had to do something about doing that change. But the XP rhythm is not set up to deal with that kind of thing. You have the stories at the beginning of the week. You go through those stories day by day to the end of the iteration. So Team A realised that this was obviously an issue, and they had to do something about it. So when they came to the retrospective, they said, right, that's not working, what are we going to do about it? And they changed what they did for the next iteration. So that whole notion of constant improvement, reflection and improvement is quite key. So they go through what worked, what didn't work, and how can we improve. At the end of an iteration, that might be just an hour. At the end of a release, it might be as long as a day. And there's all sorts of things in between. But it's actually quite important to do that kind of retrospective. There are some things that we've noticed and indeed are recognised by teams as being problems. It's a very nice idea to have a team that has customers, managers, developers in, and they're all working nicely together and they help each other and they support what each other's trying to achieve. But in reality, you get some really quite different clashes of culture. For example, in the large international bank, we had customers and developers together, and they worked together. But there were these sort of undercurrents of things going on. The development team were very much bought into XP. We do 40-hour weeks. We're doing time boxing. We want regular feedback. That's the way they were. That's the culture they had developed in their team. But the customers sat in the wider bank, and the culture in the bank was you work however many hours it takes to get done what needs to get done, because we're a business here and we're making money. And there was one particular occasion where the customers said, this thing has to be done, and you're coming in at the weekend to do it, aren't you? And the developers said, no, we're not. And that caused a lot of, we were there, and so I think their reaction was tempered because we were present. But there was a clear cultural schism there, that, this is not the way it's supposed to work. Both sides were saying that. So they did sort of sort it out. They did come to an agreement. But as I say, there are these kinds of cultural problems. There are cases where XP goes into a company and people start using it, and the culture of the organisation stops it being successful. The insurance company I talked about with the COBOL and the Smalltalk people, the culture of the organisation stopped it happening. They'd been very successful and developed a system, which was very successful and is still running, and you can see it online now, but the organisation didn't like XP, and so it didn't happen. So there are problems with the organisational cultures and team members' own cultures. You also have an issue of confidence and trust. Yes, it's very nice again to have this notion of everybody respects everybody else's views, and we're very confident that we can get this done, and we're confident that the customer's giving us the requirements that are the right requirements, whatever that may mean. But actually, again, there's people they can be playing political games for various reasons, as people do in companies. They have their own agenda for stuff. Sometimes building up trust between two developers can be quite difficult for all sorts of reasons. So it does rely very much on confidence in each other and trust between each other, and that can be quite difficult to build up.
Can I just ask about pay? I mean, these guys in pair programs, are they paid on the basis of their past experience, or I mean, clearly they're paid slightly different rates? Because
you're all doing the same stuff, and you all get to do the same technically challenging work, there is very little differentiation between people. I mean, you might have someone who's a novice and someone who's more experienced. I mean, you obviously still have that kind of situation, but they are being exposed basically to the same kinds of challenges. So their pay may well be differentiated because one's a junior and one's more experienced. But how you actually show that you've made progress in order to be promoted is a problem. So there are issues around that, and each team deals with it differently. The team that was the multi-author environment, the C++ team, they basically had an agreement that anybody who wanted to leave the company and go to another job, they would sign them off under any job title they wanted to come up with. So if they wanted to be a senior systems analyst, fine. If they wanted to be a solutions designer, fine. If they wanted to be, user interface designer, fine. It didn't matter, because they had exactly these issues. How do you differentiate between people? So that's the promotion thing. But the other thing is boredom. You come in each day and you know what's going to happen. You're going to work on the same code with the same people, doing the same kind of stuff. And you're going to do it again next week. And you're going to work on the same code with the same people, doing the same stuff. And people actually have reported this as being quite boring. And so some people get out of XP for those reasons. Something else that I've come across that has only been mentioned to me a few times, but it's one of these things that sort of crops up in different places and you begin to think there's something in here. If you've spent all your time developing with pairs, in a pair, you lose your confidence. The first time I came across this, there was a very experienced guy who was technically very good. And I was sort of sitting with him while he was doing something. And he sort of stopped and he turned to me and he said, "I'm finding this really difficult." "What do you find difficult? Do you want me to go away?" Because I thought to start with it was me. He said, "Well, I've spent years pairing, and now we've stopped pairing for a bit. I'm on my own, and I don't know whether what I'm doing is right." And it was a real sort of surprise to him, and it's something that time hadn't occurred to me. But if you've got somebody there who's always saying, "Yep, that's good. Yep, go ahead, do it. Yep, agreed. Yep," someone checking what you're doing, and then suddenly you're on your own. It has a problem. It gives you a problem of confidence. And I've had it, as I say, I've had it now mentioned to me by about 4 or 5 different people in different teams under different circumstances. So there's something in that which I haven't quite bottomed out. So there are those issues of sustainability, but what you do get is a huge amount of energy, some really great teamwork, and a lot of excitement going on with people developing stuff. I mean, it really is. The fun has come back into software development for many of the people involved in teams. Having seen this, we wanted to understand a bit more about how does it work? How does it work? Why does it work? And where might it fall down? So if you change stuff, because there's quite a lot of work done, and companies are saying, well, we can't possibly do all these things. We can't do pairing. We can't do continuous integration. We can't have customers on site. We can't release customers to have that kind of involvement in development. So there's a lot of discussion about what practices can you do without, basically. So we started to inquire into that in a bit more detail. Why does this work? How does it work? And so we turned to distributed cognition, which is a theoretical framework that comes out of cognitive psychology. I'm not a cognitive psychologist. I'm not a psychologist. So it's a bit of a struggle, was a bit of a struggle to come to terms with this. But basically it's used for analysing collaborative work. So the kinds of things it's been used for in the past are ship navigation, aeroplane flying, call centres. It has been used in the HCI area to try and understand interaction with software. So it had been used in a variety of different places, so we thought we'd have a go and looking at it. And the key thing is that cognition generally is about stuff that's in the head. When you talk about cognition, it's normally to do with stuff inside the head. But distributed cognition sees the people the environment and the things people use, the artifacts that they use, as one system. So that's like the idea behind it, really, is to try and understand how all those different things work together to produce, in our case, the teamwork, to produce the collaborative work. It focuses on information propagation and transformation. So where does information get passed to whom? What transformation happens? So when I'm talking to you, there's a transformation between my brain, my mouth, through to your ears and into your head. Right? So that is a transformation. And if you write it down, you're transforming again into something different. Hopefully those things are all consistent, but they're not necessarily consistent. And we picked up on it because it has been used to answer these sorts of what-if questions and to identify where things might go wrong. As I said, I'm not a cognitive psychologist, so we picked up on this particular take on distributed cognition, and I won't go through the details. I can give you some references to it if you're interested. But basically, it gave us an accessible way to start looking at some of these issues. And the key things are the artifact theme and the information flow theme. They're the two things that I was going to talk briefly about today. So, artifacts. There are two key artifacts that we found that are fundamental to coordination and collaboration in these teams. This analysis is actually based on one team, which is Team E. They're the people who do the travel information. And the two artifacts are the index cards, these story cards, and what we call the wall. These are photographs of the actual things. The index cards, you'll notice one is green and one is white, and that is actually significant. The green cards are what's called story cards in this team, and the white cards are task cards. And what often happens is that story, because it's too big, gets broken down into tasks. So those two are related. But you have this, and you can see there's various annotations on here. You've got the actual story, well, it's on a task card, so I guess technically speaking it's a task, but people still call them stories. But you have the thing written here that you've got to do, and then you see there's different colour writing and ticks and all sorts of different things on it, and that all means stuff. That's all significant. One of the things that I think, a message that often gets out, and certainly I was sitting on a panel at a conference, and somebody stood up and said, "Oh, Agile development, that just means that developers don't have to write any documentation. That's all it's about. It's just an excuse to not write documentation." That's the kind of thing that some people think is true. XP teams have to be incredibly disciplined because there isn't much documentation, because they're relying on each other and informal communication, and communication through stuff like story cards. It's terribly disciplined, because if you get somebody who does something out of step, the system falls apart. Okay, so, and I hope you'll see some of this through some of the analysis of these cards. So anyway, so you've got the cards there, so they've got annotations on them, and they all mean something. Different colours are relevant. And then over here you have something called the wall. And at the end of the planning game, once they've decided what stories they're going to do this iteration, the cards get put up on the wall. So this, if you like, is a kind of a project plan. It's a real live Gantt chart of things actually happening, what's going on here. And in fact, this was at the end of an iteration. So at the beginning, you'd have these cards spread up over the wall, but as it's at the end, they're all at the bottom. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But these two things are key coordination and collaboration. So this is actually a model of the card that you've just seen. This isn't something that is out of a textbook. This is actually what they did. This all the cards around looked just like this. You had the project title at the top left-hand side. They had a spreadsheet which had the company's overall view of the work and the customers and what had to be done for their customers. And that was linked to the workload plan row in the top right-hand corner. So each card had a number that related back to that spreadsheet. They had the story in the middle. Then the green initials and the estimates is what happened at the planning game. So again, Joe Bloggs estimated this would take a day. So it would be JB 1 day in green. Then there's initials and actual on the right-hand side in blue is how when people picked up the card, they'd spend half a day on it, they'd write their initials, and how long they'd spent on it. And some of these cards would have several of these initials and actuals on them. So it sort of adds up as time goes by with the date. Don't know why the date tended to be written in black. And then once the card was finished with, so the story had been implemented and tested, it had a red tick put on it. This is what I mean by discipline. Right? Everybody did it this way. And it's quite important because you can see at a glance what state a story card is in at any one point. So that's the card. I said the cards get put up on the wall. Again, the wall is a very visible thing in their environment. I mean, if you imagine if this was a team here, you'd have stuff all over the walls here. In the large international bank, they couldn't put things on the walls. So what they did was they had flip charts. And they actually had mobile flip charts that they'd move around. But they still had the notion of a wall of some kind where they'd put the cards. Again, this is divided up in very specific ways. In this particular team, they had a slightly more complicated kind of iteration where they'd have 1 3-week iteration and then 3 1-week iterations within it. If you can just take that on trust, I'm happy to talk about it if you want to know more, but if you can just take that on trust. Each week then had its own section of the wall, and you had the cards at the top were to do, and then once they were done, they were moved down to the bottom. And again, this was copied across every iteration that we saw. This is how the wall worked. So at any one point, you could look at the wall and you could say, oh right, look, yes, if we're halfway through week 1, that looks quite reasonable. That's okay, we've done some of the stuff, we've moved it down. If you're at the end of the iteration, that's a bit more of a problem. Something's gone wrong somewhere because you've still got all that stuff at the top of the week 1, that's to be done. But the point is it's a very immediately accessible way of looking at progress and understanding what's going on and how people collaborate. Just a comment on the dotted lines in that week 1. They had quite an interesting way of doing this because their walls were all glass. So again, if someone was working on a story, what normally happens is the card comes down off the wall and goes with them to their workstation. Well, if you take that away from the wall, then you've lost information because you don't know what's being worked on. So what they used to do was draw little ghosts of the card on the glass. So they'd take the card away, but then draw the little ghost on. So at any one time, you could always see what was going on and what was being worked on and what had left to be done. So those two things together meant that you had quite an information-rich environment for people to work within. One thing I do want to just talk about for a minute is pairing. Pair 1 and pair 2, two individuals, so they're people within the pair, person 1 and person 2 within the pair. They talk to each other, so there's information flowing between the two of them all the time. They talk about what's going on, they're discussing alternatives and what are we going to do. They're looking at the code, so they're both reading code, possibly writing code. They talk to each other through the code in the sense that one will change the code and then go, do you agree? And the other one will say, yeah, no, do this, change that. So they sort of talk, in a sense, through the code. So you've got information flowing through the code back to the individuals. But that also sits within an environment where there's an awful lot of information around them as well. You've got developer websites, so it's quite normal to have sometimes 2 monitors. I mean, it varies. Some of the teams I've seen have 2 monitors, some have 1. Always 1 PC, but I mean, they might have 2 monitors. But in the background, they'll have all sorts of different developer websites up, so they can check out things on the websites. The wiki, that's an internal company wiki, various books sitting on the desks, the story cards themselves, all sorts of annotations might be on those story cards. The estimates will be there. But sometimes on the back, you get little sketch designs. People use them to do little sketch designs to remind people of what's been decided. You're in an environment where the other developers in the room know the code base. So you've got people you can talk to. You've got people you can ask questions of. People who can overhear what you're doing and offer information to help. BizDev in this particular environment were the analysts, basically. They were the people who fronted to the customers. They had lots of information to offer as well. So if you look at the information flowing around this pair, you've got an awful lot of information which is available and which is being exchanged all the time. And one of the key things about it is it's immediately applicable. because all the developers know the code base well, any one person you call over and say, can you sort out this problem for me? They don't spend a lot of time explaining what the problem is, except the specific thing they're working on, because they know the context. The other people know the context. And that's actually quite powerful. So you have lots and lots of information flying around, and that makes a big difference to the pair. So what we've got out of doing this kind of analysis, and there's an awful lot more in here. If you want to know more, it's just that I've got a paper I can let you have, or you can talk to me by email, whatever. There are very few artifacts that XP teams used. Everywhere we went, we saw these story cards on the wall. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't other documents. And in some cases, if you have to communicate with the QA people and you have to write a testing document of some kind, then that's what happens. The testing document gets written. It's not as though you sort of say, oh, no, we can't write that document. If you need the documentation, you have it. But in terms of day-to-day working, the way that XP teams work, those are the two main artifacts that are important. And that means that there's very little transformation between the different media that's representing that information. Every time you transform something, there's a chance that you're going to have an error. If there's very little transformation going on, you're minimizing the possibility of error. As I said, conversation and immediate collaboration, talking to each other, is really important, whether that's talking to your fellow developers, talking to the customer, talking to the business analyst, talking to websites where other developers have put up information. Whoever it is you're talking to, that's really a very key thing. And the artifacts actually support that and facilitate that. The information flows are simple and they're open. It promotes this idea that everybody is aware of what's going on. You look at the wall, you understand what the situation is. You know what's happening with your development. People can hear you around, they can hear what people are talking about. Again, there's few transformations between the information as the information flows. The co-located environments people work on are very information rich. I talked about the flows around a pair. Information is relevant and it's available quickly. I can use it now. And that does create quite an energized environment. It also means that when something goes wrong, there's an awful lot of frustration that comes out as well. But doing the distributed cognition analysis allowed us to really sort of pin down some of this stuff, to understand something about why does this work and how does it work. And that whole notion of the physical artifacts, this middle one here, is something I've been working on at the moment. The large organisation I'm with at the moment, use the wall in a different way. And because they have distributed teams, they actually have an online version of the wall as well as the physical wall, which of course introduces the problems of updating and making sure that they're in sync. And but it's their way of coping with the fact that they are distributed. They can't do much about that. But this whole thing about the physical artifacts and how can you translate that into offshoring situations, distributed situations, that's something that I'm actively pursuing at the moment. So we'll be doing a bit more of this stuff anyway. One thing I just wanted to say, Agile Alliance do provide small amounts of funding for people who want to do work in this area. I have a fund of several tens of thousands of dollars a year to give to people who are doing work in Agile development. So if anybody here is interested in doing research work, a master's project, if you need support for doing that kind of work, then talk to me. Thank you very much.
Are there any final questions anybody wants to ask?
The people who write movie film scripts also use something called storyboards.
Yes.
But the storyboards are sequences, very strong dependence as you go through the film in time. Now you can do with your story cards also have dependency, but it's worse than that, because there's going to be interaction with that connectivity.
Yes.
How is that controlled? Because give me the impression, perhaps wrongly, that these cards are stacked up like a series of, like play cards. You throw them at the wall, and, and then the pairs, come in the morning, and they pick a card, and they go ahead and work on it.
That's correct. Yeah. That is how it works. However, remember you've got a development team who understands the application under development. They've got people they can talk to if they need to. I mean, the example of Team A, where you have, in a sense, discrete adverts, discrete customers, they can pick up anything, virtually anything, and work on it. However, the database migration example, they couldn't do it like that. They had to do it in particular order. In that case, the manager controlled it. I said the manager fed story cards to them. So he made sure that the ones they worked on, that iteration, were a set, if you like. So there is that level of understanding that either comes from the developers themselves because they know the application, or is done by management.
How do you do testing? If pair 1 is building a function and pair 2 is building a function, and the one that pair 2 is building needs the one that pair 1 is building in order to work, there's a dependency there.
So the developers would know that, and they wouldn't develop them in that order. When it came to stand-up, we'd say, right, well, there's these 2 cards here, but before we can do that one, we need to do that. Well, they'd make sure that the first one was done first.
How do you run the test? If people just add in code at some point, how do you run
the
test?
Okay.
Because you said you designed the test. It's test code, do the test.
So I've got a development version of the system, and then you've got the release version of the system. So I'm sitting here working with my pair, and we do some code, and we run the test on what we've got, and we run all the regression tests on what we've done. And when we know that it's all done and works, then we release it into the release version. So we're controlling what we're doing, and if we do anything that's wrong or that would conflict on what somebody else is doing, then if we conflict with what somebody else has already done because the regression testing is being done, then that catches that. If somebody else is working over there, the chances are either peripheral awareness will pick it up. I had that example where people were working on a similar bit and they ended up needing to change the same classes. But because they were sitting close to each other and they could hear what was going on, they said, oh, you're working on the same bit of code.
When you work in the defence community, you have to deal with very, very large and lengthy projects. I mean, like Rob's been involved in Sonic and all kinds of weird wonderful things. Do you think this kind of technique is likely to be accepted by the powers that be? Do you think this has a place there to try and circumvent potential pitfalls?
Other people standing here would say yes. Consultants and people who work in that business say that yes, it does scale. There's different ways of doing it. I've seen organisations where they, in a sense, have sort of like multiple teams. So you still have the core team of maybe 10, 15, 20 developers, but you might have several of those teams, and they all work together in similar ways. I think the way Microsoft works, in fact, they have. Because Microsoft did Agile development before it was called Agile development. I think the principles can be scaled with caveats, because I mean, I've never worked on a multi-billion pound project. I've worked on large projects, but not multi-billion pound. But I think it's the principles, not the practices, and that's partly why I wanted to find out what is going on here with the teams, to try and then say, okay, well, do you realise it's fine to have non-co-located teams, but what you're doing is you're losing that bit of the communication or that bit of the collaborations. You need to do something to support it if you're going to carry on with that kind of. So, but as I said, other people standing here would say yes, and there are people selling books and consultancy based on it. So.
How did you choose the teams that you studied? I'll tell you why I'm asking, because with the exception of Team A, they look as though they were formed as a result of a corporate decision to go to Agile programming, whereas there are organisations who go to similar styles of programming naturally.
Right, well, first of all, I have to say that that's not the case. Team A started up that way. The founders said that's the way we're going to work. Team E was a similar situation, that they founded a company. And, the multi-author people, literally over a weekend, but they were failing. They were a failing company. And the CEO said, we've got to do something about it. Monday morning we're doing XP. And so he did that, right. But the 2 banks, there were huge numbers of people developing software in both of these situations, most of whom were not doing XP. There were isolated teams. I think there were probably about between 4 and half a dozen teams in several thousand developers. So it wasn't
considered a trial for those teams.
There was one sort of middle management level person, I suppose, who felt that it was a good thing to be doing, and he was championing it. So he did champion that within the organisation. The non-XP developers were waiting for them to fall over. They were actually waiting for them to make a mistake. And that was, people said that to us quite openly. Okay, they're being successful now, but it'll go wrong. We know it'll go wrong. And of course, inevitably, it did eventually go wrong. And they have now capped XP in one of the organisations. They've stopped it. But I mean, there's always things that go wrong. In that particular case, they were trying to second guess regulations that were coming out. And they got it wrong. Well, it wasn't the developer's fault. The software was developed on time and it did everything that it was supposed to do. But from the business point of view, it failed because it didn't do what it was supposed to do. But no one knew what it was supposed to do when they were developing it. So it wasn't actually like that at all. To answer your first question, it's basically people that I have met So it's through personal contact or contacts of contacts. Because I've been in the Agile development arena since it sort of first started, really. Because it grew out of objects, which is where I was before. Thank you.
Helen Sharp can be contacted by email at h.c.sharp, spelt Sierra Hotel Alpha Romeo Papa, at open.ac.uk.